Sometimes even good people can make a mistake. And when it happens, it's one of the most intense and emotional experiences of your life. It could be a DUI, or maybe you were in the wrong place with the wrong people at the wrong time. Or perhaps you just did something stupid at the spur of the moment without even thinking, and now you're in trouble with the law. Well, you need experienced legal help right away so you don't become a victim of the criminal justice system. Even good people can make a mistake, and if you, a friend, or loved one has been accused of a crime, don't make another mistake by hiring the wrong attorney for the kind of help you need. You need to visit toddjohnslaw.com. That's toddjohnslaw.com, and then call Attorney Todd Johns today. Attorney Todd Johns has decades of experience helping good people like you who have made mistakes or bad decisions and will stand by you every step of the way. toddjohnslaw.com.
Hello and welcome to That's Enough Out of You, our weekly podcast where we have a lot of amazing and interesting authors and guests. And our co-host, as always, is Sean Kane. Sean, how you doing?
Billy Raids, how you doing, buddy? Ready for a big show today, buddy. Looking forward to this one.
This is going to be great. We have probably Sean, was the last time we had Joe on? Is that our highest
yeah, it's highest rated episode across all apps, Joe.
Wow.
All apps.
It's great to hear.
Yeah. So author Joe McBride joins us again, and we're thrilled to have him back. Joe, how have you been?
Great to see you again. I've been working hard on a new book, and I really enjoyed our last chat, and glad we're going to continue.
And what's the new book, Joe? Do you want to talk about it, or?
Yeah, I have a book called George Cukor's People: Acting for a Master Director, coming from Columbia University Press on December 6th. It's a critical study of the great director of such films as The Philadelphia Story, Camille, My Fair Lady, Travels with My Aunt, Star is Born with Judy Garland and James Mason. He was one of the greatest movie directors, and he was also a very wonderful director of actors. And I feel the reason I wrote it is his work hasn't been taken with enough appreciation, enough analysis, partly because he worked through his actors. He was very self-effacing in a certain way, even though he had a very distinctive style. He channeled his feelings and his themes through his actors. So I've done portraits of performances. It's a kind of experimental book of film criticism, portraits of about 60 terrific performances in his films by both stars and character actors, lesser known, but also wonderful people. So it's really a fun book, and I think people will enjoy it. It's coming out, as I say, in December, and just starting to talk about it now.
And he also
go ahead, Bill.
I'm probably going to say the same thing as you, Sean. He directed Something's Got to Give with Marilyn, right? Marilyn.
Yes, I was just going to say about Marilyn. Oh, yeah.
Yeah, I have a chapter on Marilyn Monroe. He directed her in Let's Make Love, and then he did Something's Got to Give, which was shooting when she kind of self-destructed. She couldn't work anymore. She couldn't remember her lines, and they fired her. And it's a sad story, but it's he really admired her as an actress. He was known as an actress's director. A woman's director was the phrase they used, but that's limiting. And he would get kind of irate when people said that, because he directed so many great men, such as Spencer Tracy, Cary Grant. Yeah, all kinds of great performances by men. James Mason, I mentioned in Star is Born, but many great women. Not only Monroe, but Joan Crawford, Norma Shearer, Greta Garbo in one of her greatest roles, Camille. So it's such a rich career. Many, probably any film buff you talk to would say, yeah, well, 5 or so of those movies are among my favorites. But a lot of people don't know his name because he didn't get as much publicity as some of the more ego thumping directors
Sure.
did
Right.
because he was modest and in a very good sense. He believed in collaboration, working through other people and with other people.
And he died in the early 80s, right, Joe? 82, 83, somewhere around?
Yeah, 83. But he kept directing until 1982 was his last film. He was the oldest director who ever made a Hollywood studio film at that time, and I wrote an article about that for Variety, and he told me he was thrilled I wrote that piece because it was quite an achievement to direct into his 80s. And he did Rich and Famous in 1981, 82, and I was on the set of that film, watched him shoot, and so he was a survivor of longevity. He was he was known for, among other things, being fired from Gone with the Wind, and
Wow.
that was quite a setback. But he rolled with the punches. He was a feisty survivor, and I think he was partly relieved to be freed from the struggle of that, working with David O. Selznick, and Clark Gable was hostile to him because he was gay, and things like that. But he just kept going on. He went off and did The Women, and then he did Philadelphia Story right after that, and so he knew how to navigate the treacherous Hollywood system in a way that very few other people have.
So did you know him personally, Joe?
Yeah, I interviewed him 3 different times and spent a day on the set of his last film, and I liked him personally quite a lot. He was a warm and funny and friendly guy, and very frank. His interviews were very feisty and profane. I went to his house once with my friend Todd McCarthy to interview him, and he arrived. I mean, he was in his bathrobe. He hadn't gotten dressed yet, so he said, "You boys look around. You can look at anything. Open drawers, open cabinets." So we took him literally, and we passed this fabulous wall that he had of inscribed pictures of actors that he had worked with, and I wrote down some of the inscriptions. Katharine Hepburn, he directed her in 10 films, including her first film, and she wrote to George, "Everything, Kate." Wow, what a great
Wow.
inscription. Joan
Yeah.
Crawford wrote a little more complicated than this, but it was basically to George, "The marriage offer still stands. Love, Joan."
Wow.
He really understood people so well, and he brought out the best. Katharine Hepburn said, all of your people are as goddamn good as they could possibly be, and that's your stamp." And I use that for the epigraph of the book, and that's where I thought of the word people. George Cukor's people are all as good as they could goddamn be. He brought out, Joan Crawford was not a great actress, but he made her memorable in some films like The Women. She's a delicious villainess, very, very stylish, and he did a film with her called Susan and God, which I really enjoy. It's kind of uneven, but she plays a religious fanatic. It's really funny. It's the kind of film they don't make anymore. And back actually in the early 80s, I went to MGM when I was a screenwriter, and I pitched a remake of Susan and God. I wanted to do it and make it modern and have the woman be a kind of a religious fanatic evangelical Christian. I happen to have had an ill-fated romance with somebody like that. And the executive, of course, had never heard of Susan and God, and she was horrified that the film existed, that they made a film in 1940 that was satirizing a religious fanatic. I mean, so in some ways, Hollywood was more daring back in the studio days,
Sure.
within certain limits,
Yeah.
But she said, "We can't make a film like that. Geez, we'll get pilloried by people." And and then he did a film with Crawford called A Woman's Face, where she plays this woman who's been horribly burned, and she bravely played a part where half her face was scarred, and she becomes this very bitter criminal. It's a very interesting, dark film, So he helped people take chances, and he tapped into deep recesses of their personalities. Judy Garland is never greater than in Star is Born, and she hits such emotional depths in that film. That's his best film, I think. One of my favorite films of all time. So I had a ball writing this book. It was really a great fun. And criticism has always had trouble writing about acting. It's kind of a mystery to a lot of critics. It's not the easiest thing in the world to write about, but I've had some experiences. I acted for 5 years in an Orson Welles film, The Other Side of the Wind, and I was not an actor, but Welles put me in this film playing kind of a takeoff on myself, and it was very instructive for me to have the experience of acting. And I just put up a picture. There's Cukor on the left with me on the far right in 1975, and Francois Truffaut, the great French director, there is talking to
Okay.
him, and Truffaut championed Cukor when he was a critic at Cahiers du Cinema. And but anyway, so I acted for Welles, and I did some other bit parts, and whenever I could be an extra in the film, I did it because it was very educational. And I also was a Hollywood a journalist for Variety, so I got to go on sets of films and watch all kinds of actors and directors at work and interview them. And then I also reviewed plays for Variety. I reviewed many plays, so I learned a lot about acting in the course of all that, and realized how critical it is to filmmaking. Orson Welles said the actor is the most important person in a film, and the public, that's what people go to see, is the actors. And they're as Frank Capra told me, he said they're the front line of filmmaking. If the front line collapses, the show is over, he said it. And and Wells said, and Cukor both said, the director is simply the audience, the person who understands and appreciates performances. A lot of actors have said, what we do is not seen or understood by a lot of people, and that you can't really act your best if the director doesn't get what you're doing. But Cukor got it. He was so sensitive and so smart, and said the right things to help them tap into things they had never done before, and be comfortable. And so that's why he was a great director, and he worked all the way into the modern era with Maggie Smith. A couple of his stars have just died. Mitzi Gaynor and Maggie Smith died recently, and some of them are still around. He directed Jane Fonda and Claire Bloom and other people. Anyway, I think people will enjoy this book.
And when is that out, Joe? December, mid-December?
December 6th.
Okay.
Yeah, Columbia University Press. I've done 2 books, 2 other critical studies for them, of Ernst Lubitsch and Billy Wilder, 2 of my other favorite directors.
Okay.
Yeah.
Joe, you mentioned that Orson Welles said that the actor is the most important part of the film. Do you think that's still the case? I think in this day and age, it's really, when you look at what is successful with the box office now, it's really mostly these big blockbuster, the titles, the superhero movies, that kind of stuff. Do you think it's still really actor driven, or do you think it's changed?
I think that's a good point you raised. I think there is some validity to your idea that it's changed, that the property sometimes draws people that this is the latest Marvel movie with a certain character or whatever, but still people, go to see certain performers, certain actors, and the actor carries the movie. I mean, a good movie like Oppenheimer, Cillian Murphy is superb, and if he hadn't been, the movie wouldn't have worked very well. But because he's so central to that picture. But maybe, I mean, he wasn't really a name that was known to the audience before that film, even though he had done other films. But so we have a kind of a different form of the star system today. It's changed. I mean, one example to show how it's changed along your lines. Cukor's, one of his first films he worked on was All Quiet on the Western Front, the great 1930 classic,
right?
Directed by Louis Milestone, based on the great World War I novel by Eric Maria Remarque. And Cukor helped find, he was called the dialogue director. They brought dialogue directors out from New York theater. And he helped cast all the young actors in that film, many good young men, and including Lou Ayres, the star, who was only 20 years old, and gave a memorable performance as this young German soldier. And Cukor also rehearsed and trained these young guys and worked with them all the way through. And and Milestone deserves a lot of credit for the acting too, of course, and it has great battle scenes. I mean, but what classic films did that sometimes we don't do as well today is to integrate story scenes with action. You know, the modern remake of All Quiet is a good film that just came out a couple of years ago, and it's in German, which is good to hear the actors speaking the language of the characters, but it's not as memorable in terms of story, you know, character development. The young guy is good, but he doesn't have the chance to interact with other characters as much as Lou Ayres did in that 1930 film. He had well, and there is the same character in the remake, an older man who is kind of his father figure and mentor. But in the original version, Louis Walheim gives a great performance, memorable as the older guy. And they took time to develop people and characters and dialogue scenes. And today, the executives seem to think the audience will get restless if people talk. And I've heard that from audience, from executives as far back as the 80s and thereabouts. They think also foreign audiences, which is a big part of the sales market, don't want to hear people talking. You know, they're kind of condescending to foreign audiences. All they want is action. But it is true, a lot of the younger crowd, because movies in America now are made for 12 to 24-year-old males, basically. Sure. And they're more into action than the character and psychology. And so that's changed. And so the young guy in the current All Quiet, he was good, but you don't really remember you know, his performance the way that Lou Ayres' wonderful performance still resonates with us many years later, you know.
Yeah, I think
Joe, go ahead, Bill.
I'm just going to add, you know, very few of these remakes are as good as the original. You know, sometimes sure, they're different and good in being different, but they're not, you know, you can't really compare them. And I just, you know, you get to the point where you feel like, okay, we've seen this already. Can we, you know, can we see something more original?
I wish we had more originals, you know. To your point, you know, one thing that's really good in the current All Quiet, the battle scenes are fantastically good. And the film 1917 is a wonderful film too, with great battle stuff in it. But it's kind of a stunt film. It's all as if it's one shot. And the two guys are good, but it's not so much about the actors as it is about the battles and the ambiance. And Truffaut told me, and there he is again, he said he thinks the only valid reason to do a remake is if the original film didn't work for some reason. You know, he said either miscasting or censorship, for example, or they screwed something up. But he said, unfortunately, what they do, they tend to remake classic films, which were very good. And then often the remake, as you say, is not as good. But if you go in and say, I want to remake a film that didn't do very well at the box office, or a film like Susan and God that maybe they never heard of, they'd say, well, why do that? You know, because they do it because people remember the title, you know. I mean, there was somebody announced a remake of Gone with the Wind once when I was on Variety, and you know, people laughed about that. And I talked to a producer friend of mine, and I said, why would they be crazy enough to try to remake Gone with the Wind? And he said, well, you know, it would be terrible, but he said, everybody would go for a week to see how terrible it is, and they'd make a ton of money off it, you know. And that's not a good motive to remake something. But you know, and that film has flaws certainly, but it has a lot of enduring qualities, and it would be very hard to make a movie that would be of comparable worth, even though you could portray the master-slave relations much more honestly, etc. But why not remake a film that didn't quite work? But Truffaut said they rarely do that. You know, it's just that's part of the problem.
Yeah. And I think also that, you know, they look at the technology today and they say, okay, we could do this movie again and make it look much more realistic. You know,
Sure.
the war films, I think like Planet of the Apes, those, you know, sci-fi type movies, they can do so many things today that they couldn't do back in those days. And just, you know, they say, okay, well, hey, let's make it look like, you know, what we'd really want to see. And it's very tempting, I think, for these directors and these studios to want to do that.
Yeah, I mean, you think of, let's say, Kubrick's great World War I film, Paths of Glory, a magnificent film made in 1957, great battle scenes and great story, great acting. And they could do it again with, you know, more modern kind of technology with drones and Steadicam and all kinds of stuff. But it probably wouldn't be as good as the first film, because the first film was fresh, and it was also the work of a master filmmaker.
Right.
Really,
It would almost be like someone saying, I'm going to re-record the Beatles because, you know, our equipment is better today.
yeah, they're kind of doing that with AI and you know, they're taking the voices of old actors and kind of repurposing them. And there was that infamous commercial where Fred Astaire danced with a vacuum cleaner, which was outrageous. You know,
that's right.
You can do anything today, but instead of, yeah, I mean, part of the problem, you know, I was talking to a psychologist friend of mine once, and I said, why is it that, you know, the trailers give away so much of the movie right up to the end? They don't want to spoil, so to speak, the ending, but they give away almost everything. And she said, well, the audience wants to feel they've already seen the movie, because the audience is afraid of new things, because for one thing, it costs a lot of money to go to a movie, and the parking and the babysitter and all this stuff. And they want to feel that they're going to like the film for sure before they go see it. So they show them a lot of the movie. And there's also this fear of the unknown, you know, like back in the 70s, there was a brief window of time where they were looking for good original scripts like Taxi Driver, Chinatown, you know. But today it's more recycling tried and true properties, which, you know, Hollywood did that a lot in the golden age. They what they tended to do then was make movies out of plays and novels that were very popular, so the audience knew the work and they'd go see it. On the other hand, there were a lot of original scripts back in those days, and they did sequels. You know, they would churn out all kinds of imitations of other films, and so it's not like it's never happened, but it's worse today. There's less interest in originality. The executives are terrified of taking a chance with something that isn't proven.
Yeah, I totally agree with you. I was going to mention that when, you know, when I want to bring up Spielberg at some point, and you know, Spielberg kind of came up in that time period, the 70s and 80s, with all of these great, you know, new directors, Scorsese and, you know, George Lucas. And I mean, just these amazing guys with just incredible imaginations came up with all these brand new properties. And you know, I consider that to be, for me anyway, the golden age, you know, the golden age of Hollywood, because it was when I was young and, you know, seeing all these amazing things for the first time. And I thought, hey, that's, you know, that's the way this is always going to, that's the way it's always going to be. We're always going to see all these new, great films and great ideas and just unbelievable, you know, new things that these directors and producers and writers came up with. And unfortunately, we kind of got stuck there.
Yeah, I mean, I was around at the time covering Hollywood for Variety, and you know, it's funny, when you're in the middle of a golden age, you don't recognize it necessarily, because I was the second string critic for Variety, and so I would get usually the, you know, not so good films to review. You know, I saw some, you know, I saw the big good films like Chinatown and Taxi Driver, as I mentioned, but I also saw a lot of the junk that was turned out and reviewed it. So I was kind of down on that era. And a friend of mine in the late 70s said, you know, we've been living through a golden age. And I said, really? And then he pointed out all these films like you mentioned. And I thought, hey, you're right, you know. But we took it for granted then that, like in early 74, you know, Godfather 2 comes out. Conversation comes out, Chinatown, all within a period of, I don't know, 2 or 3 months or something. And we took it for granted, like every week there'd be some great film coming out. But we didn't realize how good it was. But, you know, Melvin Douglas, who acted in a lot of classic films, he said the same thing about the 30s. He said, you know, we did nothing but complain back then about how much junk we were having to do. But people forget the junk and they remember the milestone
That's right.
films.
You're right.
He did Ninotchka and he did other films like that, but he also did a lot of routine films. But when he was living that, he was kind of feeling weighed down by the mediocrity of stuff. And Hollywood has always been suffered from a lack of boldness. But you know, the good directors like John Ford and Fox and Cukor and Capra from that period really did some daring films that, you know, and ironically, when a film wins a Best Picture Oscar, it's usually been turned down by every studio in town. But the filmmaker really has to work hard these days to get the film made. You know, they often have to get like 8 or 10 companies to pool their resources to make the film, and then it comes out and everybody says, isn't that great? But they kind of conveniently forget that they turned it down because it was too original, you know.
Right.
Billy Wilder in Sunset Boulevard, which is a great, all screenwriters love that film because it's about a hack screenwriter who gets killed, you know. And early in the film, he's typing away in his bathrobe and his voice is narrating, and he says, well, I wasn't having much luck selling stories. You know, I'd crank out one a week, but they weren't selling. He said, maybe they weren't original enough. Maybe they were too original. You know?
Yeah.
So that was a problem then too.
Yeah.
Joe, question for you. So one of the changes I noticed in Hollywood is years ago, it seemed like you had actors that were strictly television, and then you had actors that were strictly in the movies. And today it seems like you see a lot of these big movie actors moving into television, especially with streaming services now. You see Sylvester Stallone is in Tulsa King. You saw even in the early 2000s, Kiefer Sutherland moves into 24 and becomes a television star. From an acting standpoint, do you think it's hard to make that transition from the movies to television, or is it really not much of a difference?
Well, and this happened in the early days of TV in the 50s too, that, you know, if your career as a star is faltering, as often happens, stars often have a period of 5 or 10 years where they're popular, and then the people move on to somebody else. The really great enduring stars like John Wayne or somebody, you know, are rare that last for decades. But back then, you know, they'd wind up on TV, and sometimes they do even better on TV. Like I don't know, William Boyd, Hopalong Cassidy. He was kind of a minor film star, but he became a big TV star on that show, and that happens today too. Some of the people you mentioned, but I think there's less of a stigma on TV because TV, we streaming or cable, let's say, and broadcast TV to some extent, it's the last refuge of where adults go to see movies about people talking to each other and having relationships. So they're wonderful long form. You can do long form things like Downton Abbey and really have create memorable characters that go on for years. And you have a film star like Maggie Smith who had a whole new following. She used to complain that I was never recognized until Downton Abbey. I could go out to museums and shop and nobody would bother me, but now I can't do that.
Yeah.
But you know, she could go back and forth between the big screen and the small screen. And it is true. Also, you can have women who last longer in films, like Meryl Streep is still a star, and Jane Fonda to some extent is still a movie star
Right.
at their older age. And back in the day, you know, that wasn't as common. But you know, when I was on Variety in the 70s and 80s and early 90s, off and on, I used to think it was kind of ironic because there was a snobbery in Hollywood that movie people and movies were better than TV and TV
Right.
people. And 90% or I don't know, 80% of the paper was covering theatrical film, but most of the work was in television and we didn't pay attention to it as much as we should have. And, you know, it had the second class citizen aura. I think that's changed for the good, that TV and especially cable and streaming is considered as good as theatrical film in some ways, and even better in some ways, because as I mentioned, that the audience, target audience for theatrical films is the young male crowd. And movie, the golden age, everybody went to see the same movies. The whole family would go, and so a movie had to appeal to the parents, the grandparents, the kids, and that was really a popular medium. And now it's, most older people don't go to see um, the big hit films. They'll go to see smaller films. I mean, right now, of course, the theater market is all in flux because of everything changing, but older people tend to stay home and watch TV, and that happened back in the day too. But now there's more quality stuff on TV. I'm old enough to remember the early 50s. TV was it was expensive to buy a set, and we happened to get a TV set in 1951 because my dad, Ray McBride, was the TV, radio, and film editor of the Milwaukee Journal. So we had a set before most people did, and it was sophisticated programming. They had Omnibus, which I used to watch as a kid, which was an arts program that was really terrific, and they had live TV drama, which I used to watch, really good original stuff, and they had clowning, very funny comedy shows like Milton Berle and Jerry Lewis and Dean Martin, but it was great. And then in 53 is when most people got TVs. The price came down, and you could see, and I could see it even as a kid, that the quality was being dumbed down, and it was kind of aimed more at the lowest common denominator. And that's a curse as well as a blessing. But people complained about it, and yet there were still a lot of great series. I've been rewatching some of the Sergeant Bilko series. What a great series that was. Wow. The writing, especially when Nat Hiken, the creator, was in charge. I noticed that when he left the show after 2 years, the quality dropped off and it became kind of a typical sitcom. But in the first couple of years, it was as good as comedy gets on television. And you had the Sid Caesar, Your Show of Shows was a fantastic program.
Right.
I used to watch it. The writers are people like Neil Simon and Larry Gelbart and Mel Brooks. I mean, wow, and but you don't have original live TV drama anymore on television. It's a shame that it disappeared. They also had a lot of good variety shows. They don't have variety shows as much anymore, but anyway,
Yeah.
but you can do many good things have happened. That, for example, George Cukor directed David Copperfield in 1935. It had some wonderful actors in it. That's the main interest of the film, and it's beautifully mounted. But it goes by too fast. It's 2 hours long, and David O. Selznick, the producer, wanted to do 2 films of David Copperfield, and MGM said, well, we were reluctant to do even one. We didn't think it would make money, but it was a hit. But it's too rushed. The scenes are too short, and they don't have enough time to deal with the characters properly. But today, they do it as a miniseries, and it has been done as a miniseries, in 10 hours, 12 hours, whatever it is, and you can really explore stories now in a novelistic vein, and that's a terrific advantage for filmmakers. Sometimes they kind of wear out their welcome and you get OD'd on certain things. But I saw every single episode of Downton Abbey. I'm not as much of a TV watcher as I was when I was a kid. I saw almost everything as a kid, but I did see every single episode of Downton Abbey, and it held my interest because I remember back in the day, somebody I knew was trying to be a TV producer, and he said the trick of a TV show is you have to give the audience what they expect week after week to keep them tuning in as a habit audience. But you have to have subtle changes from season to season. You can't, people get tired of it. It's literally the same thing over and over again. But if you have too big a change, it can ruin the show.
Sure.
I think an example, I reviewed the first show of Rhoda with Valerie Harper. It was a terrific show about an unmarried woman and her travails in the 70s, and that was kind of fresh. But then in the middle of the season, they had her married off to this guy And it ruined the show because it was no longer about an unmarried woman. It was a typical sitcom about a married couple. And they realized their flaw because the ratings plummeted. So they got them separated. And then the show kind of suffered from that too. And they ruined the program. So you have to have subtle, careful changes like on Downton Abbey that, it's a saga. The characters go through what they call arcs, and you're interested in what will happen to certain people. And the butler or whatever he is, the footman who was accused of a murder, and there were subplots galore in that story that were great to follow. But so we're in kind of a iffy period. Nobody really knows the future of movies and TV. William Goldman, the screenwriter, famously wrote, "Nobody knows anything," in all caps, about the film business. It's never been more true than it is today.
Yeah, I agree with you, Joe. Getting back to one thing that you were talking about with, the TV actors sort of, being separate from the movie actors, and then you would see like television actors would sort of graduate, right? At some point, they would graduate to that movie. Like I remember with Michael J. Fox and George Clooney. And then there were some like Shelley Long, who she left the most successful TV show at that time, and thinking she was going to have this wonderful, Hollywood movie career, and it just unfortunately didn't pan out for her.
Yeah,
I think there's, there are those things too, and now it's sort of, it doesn't really matter, right? Whether you're on.
Yeah.
I think we have this technology now where we're all kind of watching all of these things in our homes. We have great TVs and great sound systems, and there's almost no difference between, going out to the theater and staying home to watch a movie, because you really get that same experience. It's not the same, community experience as sitting with a bunch of people watching it, but you still get the gist of what's happening, and you hear everything and you see everything crystal clear, which is really what you love about the movies.
Yeah, that's a really good observation. Technology drives artistic change sometimes. And you're right that if, most people watch current movies on their TVs, and the TVs get bigger and bigger. I remember when in the period when they started slicing up theaters, a big theater would be cut in two, and they'd have a smaller screen on one and a bigger screen on the other. And one of my friends at Variety said, "Well, the screens are not much bigger than you get at home." And he said, in a weird way, that's reassuring to people because it makes them feel like they're watching TV, But it's become kind of, the difference has become kind of indistinct in a sense. But there are certain kinds of people that, as you say, don't translate well to a different medium. And I think part of it, television stars generally are kind of perfect looking, beautiful people, oddly enough, and a lot of movie stars are kind of odd looking people, and that's part of why they're good, because they're distinctive. And there's a famous line by somebody who said long ago, in every great beauty has some strangeness, like Greta Garbo is kind of odd looking. Katharine Hepburn, definitely very odd looking. Cukor took a chance on her, and he directed her in 10 films. And she had ups and downs with the public, and people liked the fact that she was odd. But then there was a period where they didn't like that, and then she tried to kind of mainstream herself more. But certain people just don't make that transition. And you mentioned some who did and didn't. I mean, George Clooney certainly did, because he's a very handsome guy, perfect for TV, but he didn't make that great an impression on TV. He was on ER and he was okay, but it was an ensemble show. But he's a good leading man kind of actor, and I just saw him in Wolves, which is a good kind of star vehicle with Brad Pitt, the two guys. It's kind of a familiar story, but it works through sheer star quality. So there still are some stars that you watch a movie just to enjoy the interplay of these two guys. But there are other people who, but there's not the stigma. Some people, as you say, can go back and forth. It used to be kind of, if you went to TV, your career as a movie actor was over. I mean, I was thinking Cindy Williams, who I thought was a good young actress in the 70s, who was in some good films like American Graffiti and The
Sure.
Conversation, and she had a kind of distinctive quality. She was kind of glum and melancholy and serious as well as funny. And Cukor put her in Travels with My Aunt, and she was memorable in that film. But then she went into Laverne and Shirley and
Right.
kind
Yep.
of ruined her career in some sense. Obviously, it helped her in the sense that she became famous and made a lot of money off Laverne and Shirley, but it was a broad, pretty good show. But she never managed to get back into a movie career again. She did an occasional film, but her movie career was kind of passe by that point, and she kind of descended into the TV realm and kind of flattened out her acting into the farcical vein. And but you know, she, I'm sure, would have liked to have done more features, but they weren't offering her. She told me at the time, she said, and I had a script that I wanted her to do, and she said, "You're one of the few writers in Hollywood who can write good parts for women."
Mm.
This was in the 70s. That was the worst period for women in American film. Very few movies centered around women back then. It was male buddy movies were the thing. And
Sure.
I asked Truffaut, there he is again. I said, "Could I do an interview with you about women in movies?" Because he did this. This was the party for The Story of Adele H. that Cukor was attending the screening with Truffaut, and Isabelle Adjani, who was only 19, was great in that film and got an Oscar nomination. Partly because in that year, 1975, there were almost no good parts for women in American films. And I actually told New World Pictures, Roger Corman's company, which distributed The Story of Adele H., I said, "Campaign her for Best Actress. She has a chance." And they said, "Well, she's, you know, it's a foreign language film. She's not eligible." And I said, "That's not true. You know, Sophia Loren won an Oscar for two women in Italian." And they looked it up and said, "Oh, yeah." So they ran her as, you know, took out ads, and she got a nomination, which was remarkable. And she was disappointed. I remember I saw her at the Academy Ball that night. She was kind of leaning on the bar drunk. And I crashed the Academy Ball, and I went over to her and I said, "I'm sorry you didn't win, but you know, it's just fabulous to get nominated, you know, at your age." And she said, "Oh, go away, leave me alone." And I had had lunch with her earlier that day, and I said, "Don't you remember we had lunch this afternoon?" And she looked at me and she said, "Oh, it's you. Oh, I'm sorry. I'm sorry." You know, it's talk about Hollywood stories. But that decade was dominated by males. There are very few movies about women. The Turning Point was one with Shirley MacLaine and Anne Bancroft, a kind of female buddy movie. But at the end of the decade, I co-wrote Rock and Roll High School for Corman, which was really low budget punk rock musical, kind of under the radar of Hollywood, but it became a cult classic. But I thought, let's make it a female buddy movie, and I created these two characters who were wonderfully played by PJ Soles and Day Young. And people didn't really pay attention to it at the time, but the audience did, and it endures. And but the 30s, when Cukor made his name, was the greatest decade for women in American film, because a lot of the greatest stars who drew people to the films were women. Greta Garbo, Jean Arthur, Rosalind Russell, Norma Shearer, Joan Crawford. You could go on and on and on. And they were enough to get people to say, "Let's go see the new Joan Crawford movie," you know. And part of that was because it was the whole family would go, and often the wife would be the one who would pick the film. The father might say, "Well, I want to see a cowboy movie," or something. The mother would say, "No, we're going to go to see the women, you know, with Joan Crawford." And women often prevailed. And but in the 70s, you know, if you go out on a date, the women would have to see Peter Fonda doing a car chase movie or something.
Right.
Burt Reynolds.
Burt Reynolds. I was just
Yeah,
going to say.
yeah. And it wasn't a great decade for talk. I mean, a lot of people blame Spielberg and Lucas for ruining the movies because of the blockbuster era with Jaws and Star Wars came along. But people, Lucas pointed out that The Godfather was a blockbuster in 1972, a very
Sure.
good film.
Sure.
Gone with the Wind, he said, was a blockbuster, you know, and The Birth of a Nation, first big American feature, was a blockbuster. But what happened, actually, I think the big change in American film came because of television advertising. And most people don't talk about that, but one of the innovations of Jaws, as Roger Corman often said, it's kind of like one of my movies, but done on a big budget, $10 million, but it's like a B movie, big budget. But they took out national TV ads, 30-second ads, or 1-minute ads around the country at the same time. That was unusual. That was new. And people falsely say it was the first film that had a really wide release. It's totally untrue. It was something like 459 theaters, and there were movies that had been shown on 1,000 theater before that. But as a matter of fact, Lou Wasserman, the head of MCA, everybody knew that Jaws would be a hit. I saw it before it came out, and I thought this is going to be a huge hit. And Wasserman cut back on the number of theaters to create a kind of want-see effect. Because back then, a new movie would tend to open in big cities first and then spread out to the medium-sized cities and then eventually the small towns. And so when I saw 2001, I had to go to Chicago to see it. I was living in Milwaukee because it took like a month to get to Milwaukee. That doesn't happen anymore. But Jaws, they had the national advertising, and that's what ruined, one of the things that ruined American politics too, is that TV ads sell candidates like toothpaste.
Yeah.
And what happens is you have to dumb down the message of a movie or a political candidate to punch it home in 30 seconds or even a minute.
Sure.
And it kind of reduces the complexity of thought. And also certain candidates, they're hard to sell on TV because they're not charismatic enough or something. And certain movies are too complex to sell in a 30-second spot too. That's another problem. So they dumb down the movies ahead of time. They call that high concept, which is a horrible phrase, which means a movie you can describe in one sentence, And a lot of the great movies would be hard to describe in one sentence, like
Absolutely.
Citizen Kane or something like that,
Yeah.
Or they would suffer if you reduced it to a sentence. A rich guy winds up lonely and sad, or it doesn't do justice to the story. But you can sum up a lot of current movies with one-liners, and that shows you the kind of dumbness of a lot of current films.
Absolutely. Hey, Joe, I want to make one point, get your thought, and then we got to take a quick break. And then we'll come back and talk about a couple of your other books. You mentioned Cindy Williams a little while ago, and you kind of said that Laverne and Shirley kind of ruined her career. She actually she auditioned for the role of Princess Leia.
Yeah,
and
I've seen that audition. You can see it. Yeah,
exactly. And I would argue that really ruined Carrie Fisher's career, right? I mean, that role, she really couldn't do very much else because everybody said, "Oh, I'm not going to bring Princess Leia in for for this role." There were very few things. I mean, and she ended up being a great writer, and she did a lot of other great things in Hollywood. But that that kind of
you get typecast.
Exactly.
Yeah, well, the real sad classic example of that is George Reeves, who played Superman on TV.
Oh, sure.
In the 50s, he couldn't get any other parts because people say, "Oh, there's Superman." Even Gone with the Wind, he's in the opening scene of Gone with the Wind. People say, "Oh, Superman,"
Right.
And it really is a problem. He got very depressed about that and died a mysterious death. That's the whole story. But yeah, Cindy Williams. Well, Carrie Fisher. I don't know if she would have been a good comic character actress. She was smart. She's good in Shampoo, for example, which is one of the best early 70s comedies. A really good film. Yeah, that's true that she became typecast as Princess Leia. On the other hand, there are people like Harrison Ford, who he's well known as Indiana Jones, but he does other kind of films too, and people,
some amazing films. Yeah,
people accept him. Billy Wilder used to joke that a guy like Harrison Ford in the 30s would be a bench warmer. He said he wasn't in the category of Humphrey Bogart and James Cagney. He couldn't understand why Harrison Ford became a star. And Billy Wilder used to joke. He said, now the movie actors look like the guy next door, and he says, shit, if I want to see the guy next door, I go next door. Back then, he said, we had these beautiful people and, special people. They weren't all, beautiful. Marie Dressler was a big star. She was this kind of homely older lady, but people loved her. And Bogart was a homely guy, but he just captivated people because he was a terrific actor and he had personality and charisma and, so there's no real formula for a great star in a sense. They have special qualities you can't predict. And it takes, like I mentioned, Cukor discovered Hepburn because he saw a screen test she had done, but he had to sell her to the studio, RKO, and producer Selznick. They thought, she's really strange looking person and odd accent and all that. But he said, no, I have this feeling that she'll work. And they trusted him and she created a sensation. And within a year, she had won an Oscar in Morning Glory.
Yeah.
And became a big star. But then in the late 30s, an exhibitor took out an ad in the trades and labeled certain people as box office poison. And it was actresses, and it hurt all their careers, Katharine Hepburn and other ones. So Hepburn kind of had to go away and do, she worked with Philip Berry, the playwright, to do the play Philadelphia Story, which was written for her and modeled on her. And as Andrew Sarris wrote, it is about Katharine Hepburn. He said he saw it on stage with Blythe Danner, who's a terrific actress, but he said it didn't quite work because it's really about Katharine Hepburn. And Hepburn used that film to kind of rehabilitate herself by being this kind of strong woman who is kind of constantly put down by guys in the film. It's kind of unpleasant in some ways because she's kind of criticized a lot because she's independent minded. And so I find it a kind of a bittersweet film to watch, even though she's good in it, and Cary Grant and Jimmy Stewart are great in it. But, Blythe Danner, there's an example of a wonderful actress who never became a big movie star. She had some chances to be a big movie star. And part of the problem is Jimmy Stewart told me the old studio system was great for an actor, he said, because they picked the parts for you and they knew what they were shrewd at putting people in the right parts, and they wrote scripts for these people. And Stewart said between movies, if you weren't working, they'd have you doing things like learning how to box or learning how to fence or learning how to tap dance or something. And then when the studio system collapsed in the 50s, actors went freelance, and they're not particularly good at picking roles for themselves. They make disastrous choices. I mean, Blythe Danner did a film called Loving Molly, which was a disastrous film that she starred in. And sometimes one big turkey can ruin your career as a star.
True.
I mean, she's gone on to do a lot of good parts in the TV and stage mostly, but if you make a certain kind of flop, it really hurts your career. But back in the old days, the films would keep coming along the pipeline, and if one film didn't work, there'd be another one coming up a few months later that would revive somebody's career. And so stars were well protected then, and they aren't as protected now. That's another problem for people.
True, very true. Hey, Joe, we're going to take a real quick break for some of our sponsors, and then we'll be right back.
DK's Corner has moved. Come see us in our brand new location at 201 Cherry Street in Jessup, Pennsylvania, right across from the Jessup Plaza. Enjoy a brand new menu with hot and cold sandwiches, soups, salads, pizza, delicious breakfast, including breakfast bowls and sandwiches, specialty coffees, and DK's famous Razzle Dazzle flavor shaken espressos, and still the best cheesesteaks around. Follow DK's Corner on Facebook and Instagram, or call them at 570-209-0278 to find out about their daily specials and catering. And DK's Corner now has beautiful outdoor seating for the summer. Don't feel like leaving the house? Call DK's Corner for delivery. And we thank DK's Corner for sponsoring That's Enough Out of You. DK's Corner, now in Jessup, Pennsylvania. That's Enough Out of You is also sponsored by Case Quattro Winery, featuring over 20 flavors of wine, from dry red, dry white, and fruit for your sampling pleasure. Case Quattro Winery offers entertainment, parties, and private events. Now serving a full menu with a little something for everyone, including appetizers, salads, dinners, pizza, and desserts. Case Quattro has some of the best live entertainment in the area, with comedy and karaoke nights and live bands. Check us out on Facebook and Instagram for all of our upcoming events. And if you mention the code OUTA, that's OUTTA, you get 15% off of your order. Located on Main Street in Peckville, Pennsylvania, call 570-382-3855 for more information. And we thank Case Quattro Winery for their support.
All right, we are back with Joe McBride. Joe, real quick before we get into a couple of the books that Sean wants to talk about, I wanted to ask you about the Spielberg biography that you did. Who did you work with? Or I mean, did you get a chance to talk to Spielberg and interview him to put that together?
Well, I've met him twice. I actually spent an hour with him when he was 27, when he did Jaws. They had an event for the press at the Universal Commissary when Jaws was coming out, and press people were sitting around tables talking to young Spielberg, and I remember talking to him, and then I met him once later. But I write unauthorized biographies. For one thing, my new book, George Cukor's People, is a critical study, not a biography, and people sometimes get confused about this. A biography is, life story, and when I write about artists like John Ford, Spielberg, and Frank Capra, who I've done big biographies of, I write about their work in depth too, because it's what they call a critical biography. And if you're writing about an artist of any kind, I think you need to deal with their work. But a critical study is purely focused on the work, although when I say purely, that's not 100% true. You bring in biographical data and information about the making of films and things, but the focus is on the work. But when I do biographies, which I don't do anymore because for a lot of reasons, I do unauthorized biographies, and sometimes that has a stigma. People think, well, that's sensationalistic. But in my opinion, if you're going to do a biography and it's authorized, you're compromised.
Right.
And I worked with Robert Gottlieb, famous editor, who was at first my editor on the Frank Capra book, and then it turned out he was trying to undermine me. It's a long story. I wrote a book called Frankly Unmasking Frank Capra about how Gottlieb and Janine Basinger, who's Capra's archivist, sabotaged my book and tried to kill it and neuter it. And I prevailed in a 4-year legal battle. It was really tough, but it came out. The book came out really well. Frank Capra, The Catastrophe of Success. But the point being that if you authorize a book, Gottlieb said there's always a price to be paid. And he also lied and told me, he said, we don't authorize books here. We don't authorize biographies. And then I began noticing in the acknowledgments of every biography published by Knopf that they were all authorized. He was just lying about it. And if you authorize a biography, that means the subject has veto power over certain things.
Right.
Don't write about my first wife, or don't write about this thing I did, and blah 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 blah. And I would find that intolerable. And so Capra cooperated a lot for a year and gave me interviews, and then he had a series of strokes, and I couldn't talk to him anymore. But it was an uneasy series of interviews, but valuable. But he and his family, parts of the family, tried to stop the book too, but other parts of the family were supportive. But when I did John Ford biography, I had interviewed Ford when I was young, before I launched I started writing that biography in 1971. I interviewed Ford in 1970, and I was doing a critical study of him with Mike Wilmington, and that came out again recently in an updated edition. But Ford died in 73, but that was an unauthorized book. And there was an authorized biography by Scott Iman, who got Ford's estate to cooperate. So, you can't quote certain unpublished materials and things usually if it's unauthorized. But with Spielberg, there had been a few biographies written of him that weren't very good. There was one little one that came out early that was fairly good, but they all relied on, Spielberg gives many interviews, and he gives really good interviews. He's very eloquent and very self-analytical. And so if you want to find quotes from Spielberg on almost anything, they're easy to find. You can quote from articles, and I did that. But I made it clear to him, first of all, I interviewed 100 people before I wrote to him and said, I'm doing this book. I wanted to have it as a kind of fait accompli, and I wound up interviewing 327 people. And
Wow.
the other biographers had not interviewed anybody else hardly at all, except, like 6 people or something. But I interviewed, it was to have a living subject who was still working, made it a privilege in some ways, because I could interview his father, for example, who had never been interviewed. His mother was interviewed a lot because she was a real character, but his dad, Arnold Spielberg, was a fascinating guy who had a lot of influence on his son's work. Their early films that Steven did, I spent a lot of time interviewing the kids that worked on Steven's amateur films. Billy Wilder said Steven Spielberg was a great director when he was 10 years old. It's actually true.
Yeah.
It's actually true. But the kids said, we thought it was we weren't sure if Mr. Spielberg was directing or Steven. It was a father-son hobby for a while. And that part of the story wasn't really known. I interviewed all these kids, and I interviewed his teachers and his neighbors and babysitters and Boy Scout leader, and all these kind of people who were still around. And I would have loved to have interviewed Frank Capra's parents, fascinating people, but I learned about them through their children and grandchildren and nieces and nephews and people like that. But I wrote to Spielberg and I said, I do unauthorized biographies, but I would love to talk to you and love to ask you. I needed to find out what his amateur films were at that point, because there wasn't a list of them.
IMDb, yeah, right.
Yeah, well, now they have them, because I did a lot of research to find out what they were.
Yeah.
And I heard back from his publicist, Marvin Levy, who's a nice man, a real gentleman. I knew him. He worked for Steven for a long, long time, and he kind of retired. But Marvin said, well, Steven knows who you are and he respects your work, but he's saving it for his autobiography. He doesn't talk to biographers, And the autobiography has yet to come, although The Fabelmans is a cinematic autobiography, which is fascinating.
Right. Yeah.
But he's never written autobiography. He's a control freak who, they're authorized books that he puts out about the making of his films that are interesting, but kind of limited in scale. But there is a kind of a biography that he cooperated on by somebody, and but it's sanitized, but I'm a control freak too, because I want control over my work, and he's a control freak. So it's 2 control freaks banging into each other. But I will say that he was actually, in some ways, the most helpful of the 3 subjects I dealt with, in some ways, because people would call up Spielberg's office and say, should we talk to this guy McBride? And they were told I was kosher. That was the word that was used, which I thought was really nice,
Yeah.
And that opened doors. People would talk to me. But his mother, he asked his mother not to talk to me, which is funny, because your mother knows really the bad stuff about you. She knows what's under your bed and
That's true.
all the crap that you have in your room and all the bad behavior you do. But I got to his dad. His dad didn't call up Steven and say, should I talk to Joe? And when Steven found out his dad talked to me, he said, don't talk to him again. And actually, the saddest thing I found when I did that book was his father said, you know more about Steve than I do, is what he said.
Oh,
I
geez.
thought, gee, that's really sad,
Yeah.
His oldest friends and his family call him Steve. He didn't become Steven until he became like an important guy.
Right.
Stevie was another name they used when he was a kid. He was a mischievous kid, a kind of maverick, prankster, filmmaker kind of guy. So Steven didn't talk to me for the book, but it didn't hurt the book, because, as I say, I had quotes from him on almost any subject. And same with his mother. I could find quotes from her on almost any subject. But, you know, the Fablemans had that big revelation about his mother having the affair with their friend, and how Steven found out about it by making a film, which is fascinating.
Right.
I actually figured out that story through my sources, that, you know, Steven used to blame his father for the breakup of the family, and had this schism with his dad that lasted for a long time. And I felt the father was getting kind of a raw deal. And one of my motives in the book was to try to spotlight what his father did for him. And I kind of hoped that they would get back together. And I think the book contributed to them getting back together, which was such a big event that it was on the cover of Life magazine.
Wow.
Steven and his father are friendly again, and it was a really positive development for him. But I found out that his mother had an affair with one of their best friends, and I also found out from Steven's friends that he blamed his mother at the time. And one of the pals that he had in high school said he was really angry at his mother, and she drove a Jeep around town, and she would drive, they would be walking to school, and she'd drive past them in the Jeep and say, "Come on, I'll give you a ride." And Stephen would blow her off, you know, because
Wow.
he was mad. But I had to be sort of circumspect in writing about that, but it's in my book. But I didn't know this fascinating thing about how Stephen discovered it through film, you know, as he relates in Fablemans. So that is the kind of thing that you find out in autobiographies. But I think I covered the subject as well as you could for a living subject. It was interesting who wouldn't talk to me. The people who were most skittish were actors. Actors tend to be very timid people. And a lot of the actors in his films didn't respond to requests, like Richard Dreyfuss and people like that. But some of them talked to me. I had some very good interviews, but it turned out the people who worked with him early on in like his TV period and early features were very happy to talk to me, because they wanted people to know that, you know, like the producer of Duel, George Eckstein, was a terrific interview, and Frank Morris, who edited Duel, and Alan Davia, who shot some of his early films. And those people were very proud of working on Steven's films, and so they were great sources. And some of the actors who worked for him on TV, you know, for example, there's a guy named Anson Williams, who was a young actor who was in one of his TV shows, and he later became a TV director. TV director, yeah. And he had a great comment. He said, you know, Steven is a great director of actors, and people don't realize that, which I really think is true. And I concentrated on that in my book too. And he said, anybody can get a great performance out of Al Pacino, but only Steven Spielberg could get a great performance out of a rubber puppet.
That's true.
That's such a great observation, you know.
Yeah.
So I learned a lot about him from, you know, I really covered the territory by interviewing everybody I could find. And so there's some gaps and all that, but that's what happens when you do a book with a living person. But you get the benefit of talking to people who, you know, on the Capra book, I interviewed 185 people, and I think they're all gone now. You know, you couldn't do that book again.
Yeah.
You know, I got to them in the nick of time. I interviewed 2 Capra screenwriters, for example, who were both dead within the next 11 days.
Oh, wow.
You know, I mean, I was racing the Grim Reaper in that book, you know, but it was priceless to talk to all kinds of. I interviewed people who knew Capra as a boy, his neighbors, you know, and his schoolmates and people like that. And I put a lot of attention on the early life of somebody. Let me just hold on one second. I want to get a quote here. Just one second. I'm reading Michael Korda's book on Ulysses S. Grant, who was Steven bought the Ron Chernow book on Grant, which is terrific. And I hope he makes a biopic of Grant. Ford wanted to make it, and he never was able to do it. But Grant's story would be a great film. And Grant is a good character in Steven's film Lincoln. But anyway, Grant, this is the epigraph of Korda's book. Grant said, "I read but few lives of great men because biographers do not, as a rule, tell enough about the formative period of life. What I want to know is what a man did as a boy." What a great quote, you know.
Wow.
And so I spent a lot of time my first biography, Capra spent a tremendous amount of time interviewing his schoolmates and people who knew him in the neighborhood. And how did this guy get formed? Because psychologists tell us in the first 7 years of life, we're mostly formed. But those are the years that are hardest to recover. And biographers at that point, film biographers back then tended not to spend much time on the period before the person became a filmmaker, like it wasn't interesting. And they tended to interview mostly movie stars who actually know the least often about films, because they come in and they're only in it for part of the time, unlike the crew people who are great sources, who are there all the way through and can really tell you how the film is made. But stars come in and they're often narcissistic and focused on themselves. But I wanted to know how these people were formed in Capra's life. I spent a whole chapter on his high school years, and I remember my original editor, not Gottlieb, but the second editor at Knopf, said, "High school, why are you focusing on high school so much?" And well, I said that was the time when he left his neighborhood and went out into a world. He lived in a multi-ethnic neighborhood in LA, and it was actually kind of friendly and people kind of got along. And then he moved into a WASP dominated high school where he was treated as an immigrant, and he was looked down on as an immigrant. He's from Sicily, and he said in his book and to me, "Oh yeah, I had a wonderful time there," and I kept interviewing people, and the 18th person I interviewed was a woman who was the class historian, and I said, "What'd you think of Frank then?" She said, "Well, he was a nice boy. He was just a terrible wop." And I thought, wow, it was really a blow. And this woman actually dated him a little bit, and she kind of liked him, but she told me her parents told her to stop seeing him because he was an Italian immigrant. And nice boy, but terrible wop. And I felt angry for his sake. And then I went back to him and I said, "This is what this woman said." And she said, "People wouldn't associate with you because you were an immigrant." And Capra said, "Well, that's true. They looked down on me because I wore cardboard shoes and I had shabby clothing, and I had a job cleaning the blackboards in the morning before school, and they thought of me as a workman, and the whole story opened up, but I had to keep interviewing people to find out the whole story. And then so that was part of the game I played with Capra, that I had to find out the truth from somebody else before he would admit it. He would lie at first. His autobiography is a pack of lies, mostly. The only things that really check out in there, that he gives the date of his birth correct and the date that the boat left for America, and I double checked them both against. I went to Washington to get the census for his neighborhood too. And he also said I grew up in an Italian ghetto in Los Angeles, and that wasn't true. It was a multi-ethnic neighborhood, but I had to find that out from the census. And the New York Times had a little item about when the ship arrived for America, and I got the ship manifest at the National Archive. It said when the ship left, and it had the list of all the passengers. One thing I didn't put in the book, maybe it's in Frankly, my book about the book, there was a Coppola on the ship and a Sinatra.
Interesting. Wow.
And I told that to Capra. I said, "Did you know there was a Coppola on the boat and a Sinatra?" And he said, "Really?" "Oh," he said, "they can go back where they came from for all I'm concerned." He hated both Coppola and Sinatra. But Frank Sinatra came from the neighboring village of Corleone. That's where Frank Sinatra's people came from. And I got the birth certificate for Sicily. It checked out, but almost everything else was a pack of lies, and it's like a novel about Hollywood. So I had to reinvent the wheel of Capra scholarship, which was a great challenge and great fun. I love the research part of doing books. That's the fun part. The hard part is the writing, and in that case, the 4-year legal battle we got the book on.
Fascinating.
Yeah.
That's great.
So let's change the Bill, you want to take a break and then?
Sure. We'll take a quick break, then we'll come back and we'll talk about. I know, Sean, you want to get back into the nightmare, right? And political truth. So we'll do that. We'll take a real quick break and come right back. And we would like to thank our sponsor, Gracious Day Grains. Sean, you like to eat healthy, don't you?
Always, buddy. I try to eat healthy as much as I can.
Yeah, and there is nothing healthier than what they call like farm to table, right? So when you can get something right from the ground and make it and then put it right on your table. And Gracious Day Grains, they have a tremendous selection, and it's totally organic. Everything is, they don't use any sort of herbicides or pesticides or anything like that. They have a bunch of different products on their website, Gracious Day Grains. So if you go to graciousdaymilling.com, you'll find a bunch of great stuff there, Sean.
Yeah, you will, Billy, and it's owned by Tom Maxey, who's a great guy from Virginia. He's a truth seeker, just like me and you, buddy. And Tom's growing philosophy follows the wisdom of farmers of centuries past. And a quote from Tom is, "If we practice the right rotations, we exclude the bugs and weeds without needing herbicides or pesticides." So, I mean, this is great, Billy. I mean, what he's doing is fantastic.
There's cornbread mix, there's cornmeal, popcorn he sells, buckwheat Sean, have you had buckwheat pancakes?
No, buddy.
Oh my, they're delicious. I love buckwheat pancakes. And Gracious Day Grains sells buckwheat pancakes. Just go to their website and you'll be able to find all of this stuff there. You can order it right off the website. You can find out all about how they farm and their whole philosophy, Tom's philosophy. It's great stuff.
It really is, Billy. And one of the things he does is he grinds small batches at very low temperatures, which retains the flavor and the freshness.
Of course. And it can't get any fresher than that. I mean, it's literally right from the ground. So again, go to graciousdaymilling.com and just, take a look on there. You can order whatever you want and they'll send it right to your door. Again, it doesn't get any fresher than that, right from Tom's farm to your door to your table. So
absolutely. And eat healthy and you'll feel better.
Absolutely. I wish I could do that. I wish I could eat healthier, Sean.
We'll start with Tom's stuff, buddy.
I'm going to order some of those buckwheat pancakes. I love
There you go. I'm going to try them too, Billy.
Yeah, they're really good. All right. Gracious Day. We thank Gracious Day Grains for their sponsorship.
Thank you.
Right. Welcome back to That's Enough Out of You. Again, we're here with Joe McBride, the great author and film critic and so many things that he's done, writer, just an amazing career. Sean, I know a couple of things you wanted to get back into. Last time we had Joe on, we talked about Into the Nightmare. I know you had some more follow-up on that.
Yeah, Joe, last time you were on, we didn't get a chance to get into some of the things in the book. And one of the chapters I found very interesting was your work on military intelligence and their possible involvement in the assassination of JFK, and a couple suspects that you brought out in the book. Jack Crichton was one of them. Very interesting suspect, and Lumpkin and Whitmire, and this whole military intelligence angle that I don't think is really covered that well, but your book did a great job of covering it. Do you want to get into that a little bit?
Thank you. Yeah, I delved into the milieu of the Dallas Police Department quite heavily because Into the Nightmare is both about the murder of President Kennedy and the murder of Officer J.D. Tippit, which had not been covered very well, until I came along. That was one of my motives for doing the book, because Penn Jones, who's my journalistic mentor, who a lot of viewers will know who he is, he was this feisty, independent newspaper editor publisher from Midlothian, Texas, which is a suburb of Dallas, or it's 24 miles from Dallas. And I got to know him on my first visit to Dallas, which was the 20th anniversary of the assassination. Penn would lead a memorial service on the grassy knoll every year, and I walked up to him, and he wore overalls and a gimme cap. He was just a regular old guy, and a tremendous editor, a great inspiration. And so he and I hit it off right away, because old newspaper guys hit it off, even though I wasn't that old. But if you're a newspaper guy, you're old. He reminded me of Sam Fuller, the great filmmaker who was a newspaper guy. He and I hit it off well, and Sam and Penn were very similar. Penn said to me, and he said to other people, take one aspect of the case, one that hasn't been covered enough, and research the hell out of it. So I thought, well, Tippit's murder, obviously mystery. It had a lot to do with the assassination. What was that about? Because the Warren Commission and the police basically used that to convince people that Oswald had shot Kennedy. I don't think he shot either Kennedy or Tippit, but
Right.
they basically kind of, one of the little known facts is that Oswald was never even arraigned for shooting Kennedy. He was only arraigned for shooting Tippit. He was charged with both crimes, but in his midnight press conference, which I watched live and a lot of people saw, he was asked, did he shoot the president? He was really surprised, and some people thought he was lying, but Detective Jim Lavelle, who was part of the interrogation, said Oswald was telling the truth. We hadn't told him yet that we thought he'd murdered Kennedy. Oswald said, I'm accused of murdering a policeman. I know nothing more than that. But I heard the reporters in the hall ask me that question about Kennedy. But he hadn't been arraigned for the murder of Kennedy, and he was never arraigned according to an FBI document. And Lavelle, I interviewed him and DA Henry Wade. Lavelle indicated to me that Will Fritz, the head of homicide, told him basically to wrap up Oswald on the shooting of Tippit in case we don't have enough to get him on the shooting of Kennedy. Basically, they didn't have a case on him for shooting Kennedy.
Sure.
Even though they told the public that he was the guy, they really didn't have much of anything. And I said, well, what did you have on Tippit case? He said, well, we had witnesses. And that was like a tacit admission. They didn't have witnesses on the Kennedy shooting, but the witnesses on the Tippit shooting it's like the Japanese movie Rashomon. About 20 people saw all or parts of that. And their stories conflict in very basic ways. It's very interesting. And I spent decades trying to figure out what the conflicts were in the witness testimony and what that meant. But the logic of the Tippit charge was, if a guy shot a cop 39 minutes after Kennedy was killed, he must have killed Kennedy.
Right, of course.
That was the psychology they sold to the American public. Why else would he shoot this cop? I mean, Lavelle said, cryptically, he said, I'm not sure the Tippit murder really had to do anything with the murder of Kennedy, which I disagree, but that's what he said. And there are other theories, but the idea then was, why else would he shoot this cop? He was fleeing from killing Kennedy and he was desperate, but that's logically incorrect. He could have shot a policeman and not shot Kennedy. Maybe he was worried about being caught. I mean, he said he was a patsy. And there are many reasons people shoot policemen, but anyway, so I thought, let's study it. The Warren Commission had barely touched on the Tippit murder, like they didn't want to deal with it. And Gary Murr did a little short book in 1971 that's still never been published, but it circulates on the murder of Tippit, a pretty good book for its time. But the House Select Committee did a little research on Tippit, but not much. But it really hadn't been covered. So I did the first real investigation. Dale Myers did what I call the Warren report of the Tippit case. He wrote a book called With Malice. And all you need to know is the title, because the title is prejudicial about
Sure, absolutely.
Oswald did it with malice. Well,
Yeah.
You start with the conclusion. It's like Alice in Wonderland, verdict first, trial later, But he did turn up some interesting information, but a lot of the things that conflict with his claim that Oswald killed Tippit are buried in the footnotes in the back of the book and dismissed. He'll say, well, Mrs. Aquila Clemens saw two men involved, she said. And, then he dismisses that claim for whatever reason, but he doesn't really entertain seriously contrary claims. And if you're going to make an assertion, you have to, as a historian, disprove contrary information, and so there are all kinds of things that are not explored thoroughly in that book. So I really took it upon myself to do that, and I believe I advanced the case. I found out what Tippit was doing. He and another policeman, William Menzel, were hunting down Oswald in Oak Cliff.
Right.
And officially, the police didn't know who Oswald was until they arrested him at the theater. which was 1:52 p.m. And even then, they claimed his wallet had two different IDs with different names, and so they didn't know which was the real guy. So until they got him down at the police station at 2:10, they really didn't know who this guy was. And but soon after the assassination, before 12:45, assassination happened at 12:30. Tippett and Menzel were going around Oak Cliff looking for Oswald. They knew who he was. They knew where he lived, and the Dallas police knew who he was. They had a kind of a red squad, as they used to call them, that was keeping an eye on Oswald. And I believe Oswald was an FBI informant also, and he had infiltrated the plot against Kennedy, and he was reporting to the FBI, and he didn't realize they were setting him up for it. And one of the things Henry Wade, the DA, told me, which was surprising, he said the FBI talked to Oswald the day before the assassination, and I said, the day before, and he said, well, a day or two before. And he says in his oral history with the Sixth Floor Museum that he got that from James Hosty, the FBI agent who was assigned to Oswald and Marina Oswald, that Hosty told the police that they had talked to Oswald a day or two before. And then the Dallas Morning News on the morning of the 24th of November, the day Oswald was killed, he was still alive when the paper hit the streets, said that he had talked to the FBI on November 16th. That fact had been forgotten. And then he talked to the FBI around November 12th. That was well known because Hosty testified before Congress that Oswald came into the Dallas FBI office around the 12th and left a note that he claimed was a hostile note saying, leave my wife alone or I'll attack the FBI office. But the note was destroyed on the 24th after Oswald was killed. Gordon Shanklin, the head of the FBI office, told Hosty to get rid of the note, and they flushed it down the toilet. And so Oswald met with the FBI in Dallas at least 3 times in November, which is remarkable, But anyway, to your question about military intelligence,
Right.
Oswald, the fingerprints are all over Oswald. He had worked for the CIA and Office of Naval Intelligence. He was a Marine, which is part of the Navy Department. And he was FBI informant. He was a low-level intelligence asset. And a so-called legend was created for him by the CIA. Probably David Phillips, helped set up Oswald as this disaffected communist who had gone to Russia. His so-called defection to the Soviet Union was quite obviously a false defection.
False defection, yeah.
The Soviets never trusted him. They thought he was a spy, which he was. And he was kind of kept under close surveillance for a year and then came back. And, and so, but anyway, the Dallas police had heavily contacts and infiltration with intelligence agencies,
right?
Army intelligence and other agencies. And then there was this fellow, Jack Crichton, who ran for office, political office in '64. George H.W. Bush was a political ally of Jack Crichton. And I was the guy who discovered George H.W. Bush's early CIA connections. And I ran a couple of articles in The Nation in 1988 revealing that Bush had been in the CIA before he became its director. And so he perjured himself in his hearing for confirmation, because he said he had, it seemed odd. Why were they appointing this guy who was a politician but had no intelligence background? That's what the press thought. But he was CIA from early on, and I spent a lot of time investigating that. And some people think, I was hoping other people would investigate it too, but the press back then kind of quickly stopped looking at that because Bush and the CIA said that was a different Bush. And I found that guy. They said, the CIA said, we don't know where this guy is. I found him real quickly. He was a guy named George William Bush, who was in the CIA at the same time. But he said he was a lowly map reader, a very young guy. and he had left and gone to other agencies. But he did. I found documents, FBI documents that had been released in the late 70s that people had overlooked because people didn't read them, saying that Bush had been informed, the Bush we know had been briefed on the assassination that weekend, and they were worried about the anti-Castro Cubans and how they might react, et cetera. And so there were documents about Bush being briefed. And, that led me to study his intelligence connections, which some people think went all the way back to Yale. Yale is a big breeding ground of intelligence people.
Skull and Bones.
Skull and Bones, he was a member of Skull and Bones, as was his son, George W. And Bush's father, Prescott Bush, U.S. Senator with Skull and Bones, and he was Army intelligence in World War I, so it was a family tradition, and they were part of the Eastern establishment banking
with the Rockefellers.
And all kinds of Wall Street people.
Sure.
So anyway, Crichton was an ally of Bush, and he was in the motorcade. He was riding in the motorcade, and there were other Dallas policemen who were part of this group that was tied with military intelligence. And I studied a lot how the motorcade was planned, because that's really crucial to the case, because the motorcade violated Secret Service protocols.
Yes.
By that turn down Elm Street where it took a sharp left turn, it went down to 11 miles an hour, and the Secret Service rules were that the car should never go below 25 miles an hour.
Right.
And it could have gone down Main Street, and then they could have built a little ramp to make it go up to the freeway, but instead they made that dog-leg turn. So it slowed the car down in the killing zone.
Yeah.
And then the car stopped, or came to a brief stop, and there are many witnesses who said it stopped, but we don't see that in the Zapruder film. We see it kind of slowing, but the Zapruder film was altered, and that is, not everybody in the research community agrees, but I think it's quite clear. Douglas Horne did a lot of work on that, and the Zapruder film was altered that weekend by the CIA to remove the car stop and other things. I interviewed Senator Ralph Yarborough, who was riding in convertible with LBJ and Lady Bird. All three of them were in the back seat. There were two cars behind Kennedy, and Yarborough said the car stopped and briefly, and Secret Service men jumped out of the car in front of me, and he said, I thought maybe a bomb had gone off in the car. I wasn't sure what had happened. You don't see all that in the Zapruder film either. And also President Johnson said that his Secret Service agent, Rufus Youngblood, jumped over the seat and covered him with his body on the ride to Parkland Hospital. And Robert Caro makes a big thing of that in his 4th volume of his Johnson biography. And it just didn't happen.
Yeah.
Yarborough said, it's just a complete falsehood, because he said there wasn't room for anybody in the back seat. He said, there was me and Lady Bird and Johnson. They were all kind of crammed together. And Youngblood was a big man. He said, I would have known if a big man jumped over this, but he didn't. And Johnson lied about it and promoted Youngblood. And Youngblood, in his Warren Commission testimony, was asked about that. And he became uncomfortable telling a lie. And he said something to the effect, well, if the vice president says it, yeah, that's true, but it didn't happen. And I said, so what was Johnson doing during the motorcade? And I don't think anybody had asked anybody about that. And Yarborough was all the way with him in the motorcade. He said, well, it was very odd, because he was just sitting there very quietly and not reacting to the crowd. And the crowd was very welcoming, and people were waving at him and calling his name. And he said, I told Johnson, I said, come on, wave at these people. They're happy to see you. And Johnson was lost in thought, sitting there. And he said he thought Johnson was worried about Don Reynolds, was this insurance agent guy who had been in intelligence earlier, who was testifying at that moment in Washington to a Senate subcommittee about a bribe that he had been solicited to pay Johnson, and he was giving them receipts and things. You know, the Bobby
Mhm.
Baker scandal was
Baker, yeah.
threatening Johnson's career at the time, and this is part of it. And Yarborough said to me, this is retrospective, because at the time I didn't know this hearing was taking place, but I, putting it together in my mind in retrospect, that's probably what Johnson was worried about. But as Caro does a good job of talking about the Reynolds testimony, and also Life magazine had a task force that was studying Johnson's crooked finances. There were 8 or 10 reporters on the job. They'd been running articles already about Johnson's finances with Bobby Baker, and they were meeting in New York with Life editors, and they were going to possibly run a big story in the following Friday's issue about Johnson's finances, or maybe the next issue. And when the assassination occurred, they stopped the meeting, and they thought it was improper to, you know, to dig into the new president's finances. They wound up doing a story in the summer of '64 about Johnson's finances, which was kind of eye-opening. I think they said he was worth about 10 million. Caro mentions that in his first volume. And that's a lot of money, but it underestimated. Johnson was probably worth about 25 million then, which he got all through his life as a public servant. Through, he was basically owned and operated by Brown and Root, the Houston construction company, which he got them a huge contract to build a dam when he was a young congressman. And they would funnel cash to him that he would distribute throughout the country to other Democrats in Congress. And that's how Johnson built a network of allies nationally. He was, you know, a Southern congressman who became a national figure by giving all this money, clandestine money, to people.
That became Halliburton, Brown and Root.
Yes, right? At '62, Halliburton took over Brown and Root. And so one of the things that is striking, when Kennedy was declared dead at 1 o'clock, Johnson was in another room nearby in the Parkland Hospital, and he was on the phone to his tax lawyer in Houston, Waddy Bullion, a wonderful name. And he was saying, does this mean I have to sell my goddamn Halliburton stock? You know, I mean, that's what was on his mind. And he, you know, he was talking. Yeah, you talked to Waddy Bullion again later that day. He was worried about his finances, and he managed to keep all his corrupt activities going while he was president. But, you know, he was owned and operated by Halliburton, which brought you the Vietnam War and the Iraq War, among other things. There's a book on Halliburton that I read that talked about Halliburton and 2 other big construction companies had a consortium that got 96% of the construction contracts in Vietnam. They were building things like Cam Bay, was this artificial bay that the United States was landing most of its supplies. And there was, I think, a $2 billion contract that these 3 companies shared in, which was a huge amount of money in the 60s. And Halliburton continued, you know, getting huge contracts in the Iraq War. You know, Dick Cheney was the head of Halliburton for a long time. And then when he was vice president, he still had a lot of Halliburton stock and stock options, and he was able to hold on to them, which was a huge conflict of interest. And Halliburton, you know, I mean, we don't try to win wars anymore. We just basically blow shit up and then we rebuild it. That's what
right.
You know, the United States has not won a war since 1945, which not coincidentally was the last declared war we had. Unless you count the Grenada invasion, which was considered a little war that Reagan did this attack on this tiny Caribbean island right after the Beirut barracks bombing to distract people. Reagan invaded this little island. It's like a high school senior football player beating up a kindergarten kid, you know.
Right.
But we lost the Vietnam War, we lost the Korean War, basically, and but, you know, it doesn't matter. Chomsky mentions in one of his books that if you look at the war from the viewpoint of the people who've made money off it, the Vietnam War was very successful for them. They made a ton of money off it.
Well, so they did, Rockefeller.
Yeah, and I mean, one of the things that's fascinating to me, Johnson in early '64 First of all, Kennedy was pulling out of Vietnam. This is still controversial with the mainstream media to deny it,
Yeah,
but
but
Kennedy was starting the withdrawal. And
Right.
then that weekend of the assassination, 2 days later, Johnson secretly reversed Kennedy's
Sure.
Vietnam policies, and he committed us to winning the war, expanding the war, but he had to do it clandestinely until after he was reelected. He lied about it. But in early 64, there are phone calls you can listen to online between Johnson and his mentor, Senator Richard Russell, who was a member of the Warren Commission,
Right.
or
Yep.
wise man on foreign affairs. He was a segregationist, but he knew a lot about Vietnam.
Mm-hmm.
And Russell was saying to him, don't get involved in, don't widen the war in Vietnam, because if you do, it'll take 10 years and we'll lose 50,000 Americans, which is really what
Exactly.
happened.
Yeah.
That's
Yeah.
what happened. We lost
Yeah.
58,000 Americans. They didn't mention 3 or 4 million Asians were killed, but and Johnson says, yeah, I know it's terrible. We can't win this war. And Russell says, just I'd get out of it. We can't win this war. And Johnson, it's strange on the surface, because why doesn't he just pull out? Well, that was the deal. He was put in office to widen the
Yeah.
Vietnam War, to help Halliburton and other contractors,
Sure.
the people who built the airplanes and the tanks. And there was the TFX scandal that Johnson was connected to. And the deal was, you widen the war and we'll make you president. But it ruined him. He did a lot of good things with domestic politics, Medicare, Social Security, civil rights, but
Right.
it's like a great tragedy. His presidency was destroyed by his support for the Vietnam War.
And Joe, you mentioned you're talking about a lot of powerful people there. The Brown brothers would form an alliance with Harriman, Brown Brothers Harriman, one of the largest investment companies in the world. I mean, so you're talking about the power you're talking about. I mean,
Yeah.
this is why they put Johnson in there to expand Vietnam.
Yeah, and Harriman was part of the Kennedy administration, and he was
Yeah.
the power behind the scenes. And going way back into the life of Prescott Bush, and even members of the family before that were mixed up with Harriman and other
Right.
Wall
Sure.
Street tycoons.
Mhm.
And so the Bush family, I spent about 35 pages into the nightmare, going into the far right in Texas connections with the assassination. And there
Right.
were a lot of connections.
D.H. Byrd was another one you did great work on.
D.H. Byrd, yeah. D.H. Byrd owned the Texas School Book Depository
Sure.
building.
Yeah.
And he had just bought it. It wasn't too long before that. And that building was kind of dormant until it was reactivated as a textbook depository not long before the assassination. And some people call it a Potemkin village. It was kind of a sham operation. And they maneuvered this Oswald guy into the building. And a lot of interesting research has gone on since I did Into the Nightmare. One reason you do a book is you hope other people will follow you and continue.
Right.
You take it as
Sure.
far as you can, and then other people. John Armstrong has done great
Great work.
research. I think his book Harvey and Lee is terrific. It's
We're hoping to have John on soon, hopefully.
good. Well, Harvey and Lee is one of the great books on the assassination. It's early on it was known that there were seemingly 2 Oswalds, 2 people running around at the same time doing different things. One of them was incriminating the other. And what was that all about? And Richard Popkin wrote an early book called The Second Oswald, and people couldn't quite make sense of it. But Armstrong took 10 years to do the most dogged research. And as he told me, there's a tremendous trail of paper on Oswald. And I found that when I did my Capra biography too. There's a tremendous paper trail on all of us, really, if you dig into the documentation. Some of the documents have been lost or destroyed, but here's an interesting little tale. Capra, during World War II, was in the Army and made propaganda films for the Army, the Why We Fight films and others. And he told me he was walking through a military warehouse once full of papers, with the general, and he said to the general, "What happens when you run out of space in this warehouse?" And the general turned to him with a little smile and says, "We have a fire."
Oh, wow.
In 1974, there was a fire in the St. Louis warehouse where a lot of the Army records were stored, and a lot of the World War One personnel files were destroyed. Capra's survived. He helped me get his own records, but a lot of records were destroyed. But that's what's happened in the Kennedy assassination. That the AARB, the Assassination Records Review Board, has freed literally millions of pages of documents. But as a lot of your viewers know, a lot of these documents are still withheld by the government after more than 60 years, which is a scandal. And Trump and Biden, both as presidents, have violated the JFK Records Act that mandated all the documents had to come out by 2017, unless there was some reason that the president declared that they should be withheld. And the idea was to be transparent, because secrecy feeds suspicion and distrust of the government. I write about that in my book, Political Truth, the Media and the Assassination of President Kennedy, that the public, when I was a kid, we tended to believe the government. I was a worker for Kennedy in his 1960 presidential primary campaign in Wisconsin. That's the picture I took of him the day I met him. And we tended to believe the government naively. And when Eisenhower was caught in a lie in 1960 about the U-2 flight, it was a shock that, well, the president lied to us. This is a big shock. But now we're kind of shocked, I say, if the president tells the truth. I mean, that's a little that's an extreme way of putting it.
You're right, though. You're not wrong.
They say a gaffe in Washington is when a politician inadvertently tells the truth. And they try really hard to cover things up and, or shade the truth. And
well, they deflect, Joe. They deflect. They start talking about other things, and it just, they avoid do whatever they can to avoid talking about it. Answering the question that's being asked of them.
Yeah, and I mean, a ploy that's common is to release bad information on a Friday night when people don't read the papers as much on Saturday.
Right. Exactly.
And, but you don't often. I mean, there's this kind of stages from which we get the truth. First of all, there's a lot of propaganda in the mainstream media, and then like Bob Woodward will come along and do one of his books, which is kind of the limited, modified hangout version, to use a Watergate expression.
Sure.
Right. They reveal certain things that they want revealed that are maybe half truths, but it takes about 10 years before the real truth comes out, when people write memoirs after they retire and have their pensions secure, and when documents start coming out. But as we see with the JFK case, a lot of documents are still secret, and if one lone malcontent with no discernible motive killed Kennedy, why are documents still being withheld?
Exactly.
It's absurd. So the public is, and one of the themes that I follow in Political Truth is the public has greatly lost trust in the government for valid reasons to some extent, and it's caused a huge problem in our country, because we have about 50% of the people believe one set of facts, the false things that are asserted, like immigrants are eating pets.
Right. Yeah.
And then the other half what Karl Rove called the reality-based community. Half of the people believe actual facts, and that's kind of it's a dangerous situation. We see the dangers all around us of it's impossible to have a consensus, and government is stalled, and there are a lot of false stories that are have powerful effect on people in a negative way. Some skepticism about the government is very healthy, but most people trace it back to Watergate or the Vietnam War, which really eroded trust in the government. But I trace it back to the Kennedy assassination.
Sure, absolutely.
Within a few days, the Gallup organization did a poll of Americans, and most people didn't believe that one guy did it by himself. There was a lot of doubt. And I doubted it the first day, because being already a journalist, I could see contradictions and gaps and suspicious things in the official story. So I thought Oswald was being railroaded by the end of that day. But it took, in '64, when the Warren Report came out, the public started believing that for a while. But then, dissenting views came out.
Sure.
By '66, there were a number of important books that came out, Inquest and Rush to Judgment and Sylvia Maher's great book, Accessories After the
Sure.
Fact.
Yeah.
And that kind of, and I rekindled my doubts by 66. I wrote a letter to a local newspaper in Madison, Wisconsin, saying I didn't know what to believe anymore. And I didn't believe that Oswald was guilty, you know. And so from that point on, and then when Watergate happened and the Vietnam lies were coming out, most people realized you better be skeptical of what the government claims on certain
Absolutely.
things. You have to do your own research. And I tell my students, I teach at San Francisco State, people said to me during the Iraq War, how do you know all these things that are going on that we don't know? And I said, well, I look at the little tiny stories and papers, you know, and I read about 10 sources every day and I compare them, and I try to read documents, and I read foreign publications. Like during the Iraq War, we weren't getting the truth from the American press, so I read the British press, which was more honest, you know. So the internet has really helped.
Sure.
You know, a lot of people like to dump on the internet, but I think it's been generally a source for good in many ways, because you have podcasts like this that give voice to alternative views that you don't get in the New York Times or the Washington Post, which have been lying to us about the assassination from the beginning. But also there are blogs and documents posted online you can study, but you really have to be critical and evaluate it yourself. You can't take anything at face value. That was a real good lesson I learned when I started researching the assassination. Don't take anything, any document or any person's word at face value. Compare it to the whole picture that you put together various sources, and the truth begins to emerge. But anyway, Jack Crichton was this guy who seemed to have a lot of fingerprints all over the assassination, and he was one of the people who seemed to be helping engineer the corruption of the Dallas police, you know, riding in the motorcade, and political figure and right-wing political figure, and
Sure.
and connected with the far right in Texas. And you know, for example, the TFX scandal was the Fort Worth scandal. They got a contract to build fighter planes for Vietnam, and Johnson and his cronies were involved in that. And that was a scandal that was getting attention at the time. And other Texas companies, Halliburton, were gearing up, and you had somebody like D.H. Byrd, who was involved in military contracts. He made a lot of money. He invested suspiciously in military industrial contracts right before the assassination.
Right. Sure.
And so a lot of these people seem to have advanced knowledge, or they at least benefited from the assassination.
And Joe, this has been fascinating. I know we've kept you a long time. If you would come back with us, we'd really love to talk to you, really dive deep into, you know, the book Political Truth. We have so many questions that, you know, that we didn't even get to, and I know we said that last time that we wanted to get you back here to talk about that book. But if you'd come back with us, we'd appreciate it.
Oh, I'd love to. You know, that's a big subject, the media and the assassination, because as I say, I've been a professional journalist since 1960. I sold my first article when I was 12, and I've been, I'm a media critic from way back. And I think it's very scandalous and revealing how the mainstream media have lied to us all those years. So I wrote a whole book about it. I was thinking of doing a chapter in Into the Nightmare on the media. I did one chapter on what I called the 4-day docudrama of the assassination, that literally a TV docudrama that, you know, the first day, shock, Kennedy killed, they capture a guy, then they try and convict him on TV, and they execute him on TV. Right. And then on the Monday, they have this grand funeral, and then we're all supposed to supposedly get back to normal. Dan Rather said one of the most disturbing things to me was, he said, I think about the 5th day, November 26th, when America went back to work and life returned to normal, basically, is what he said. And I sure didn't feel that way. I felt extremely disturbed and empty on that Tuesday when I went back to school. And that's the day I saw the Life magazine issue with frames from the Zapruder film. It
Right.
came out that Tuesday, and I felt that the country was changed, and it was very disturbing. It was not a reassuring thing, but that's what the media felt their job was, is to reassure us everything is going to be okay. It's sad, but let's move on.
Right.
And so I wrote a book about that, and I connected with the malaise we're in now with the public, many people not believing anything that is said by the media or by the government.
Yeah.
And
Sure.
we're in turmoil because of this, and who knows what will happen in the months ahead.
It's going to be interesting, though. That's for sure.
Yeah,
It's not
yeah.
gonna be
So I'd
boring.
be happy to come back and talk about
Yeah, we definitely want to get into that.
the
That's
media.
great.
Yeah,
Yeah. Thank
thank
you.
you.
All right. Well, Joe, this has been
Thanks, Joe. This is
fantastic.
awesome.
Really, really appreciate it. Yeah.
Thank you very much. Thanks for your good questions, and thanks for talking about my new book, George Cukor's People, Acting for a Master Director. I have these two careers, film historian and Kennedy assassination scholar, I think, is my main focus in life, but I also am a movie scholar, and it's good to have two things going on
Sure.
that are keeping you sane in a sense too.
It fits right in with us, Joe, because that's our show.
Thank you. I really enjoyed the wide-ranging discussion. Thanks so much.
Yeah.
All right. Thank you, Joe.
See you later.
All right.
right.
Take care.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
That's Enough Out of You podcast is executive produced and written by Bill Rader and Sean Kane and edited by Bill Rader. The That's Enough Out of You podcast and logo are exclusive property of Bags of Chicken, LLC. Any rebroadcast, retransmission, or accounts of this podcast without the express written consent of Bags of Chicken, LLC is prohibited. So don't even try it.